said the crime is in your bank account. You've been labeled that you're too poor to be free. And that, I think, that is basically what happens to Jean Valjean at the beginning of Les Mis. It's still happening today. And that's just horrible. And so programs like this are trying to remedy that, to ensure that people are like not going back into prison just because they're, again, quote, like too poor to be free.
Tell me what's the life? I've been feeling starstruck, seeing human love thrive in this really long dusk. Guess it's really all love, 7 billion of us, and I read the headlines. Tell me what's the life? It's potlucks of violence, corn shucked to conscience, hot sauce, blood diamonds. Everybody pitching in force red with silence. We already hit up that cold bread.
Hi, I'm Michael.
And I'm Obasi. So, my friend Michael and I have come into adulthood watching our world become more and more polarized. From political polarization to income inequality to how we even define what is real. It feels like schism and conflict are everywhere. Like everything is coming apart. It feels like we need some type of meta solution, regardless of the issue. Like, how do we come back together? What does it look like to make peace?
And at the same time, the world hasn't literally fallen apart yet. So people must be making peace on some level. So that's where we want to start. We want to learn who's making peace and how we can apply that to the rest of our world.
So join us as we try to find everyday peacemakers and learn what peacemaking means to them.
Each episode, we'll learn one principle of peacemaking from our guest. These are featured as a growing tribute to our guests and their wisdom at principlesofpeacemaking.org.
Today's guest is Siobhan, a writer and journalist who spent 3 years after college working in international development in Zambia and India. She has 3 stories for us, about mercy and about what it means to be a peacemaker when you're the one who's been stolen from. This episode's principle of peacemaking takes the form of a question. Who here needs mercy? Your story of peacemaking, we've talked about it a little bit beforehand. It is about a book, right?
Yeah, it's actually about Les Miserables. So a lot of people are maybe more familiar with the musical / movie, but it basically has the same plot as the book, but without a lot of the digressions that the book goes on. So I love the book, but it's not for everyone. It's made like 1,000 pages. It goes into like long digressions about the Napoleonic Wars and the Paris sewer systems, which is really interesting. But at the heart of the book, I think it is a story about mercy. It's a story about justice and a story about peacemaking. At the heart of the story is this guy called Jean Valjean. And he, at the beginning of the story, is kind of on parole. He's been in prison for 19 years for basically stealing a loaf of bread and then trying to escape from prison multiple times. So the first scene in the book basically is he goes and stays with a bishop and ends up stealing some of the bishop's stuff. The authorities bring him back to the bishop, and the bishop says, "No, I just gave it to him." Actually gives him the stuff and then gives him some silver candlesticks as well, and says, I want you to take these candlesticks and make an honest man out of yourself. So I think that's the first instance of mercy in the book. It's how it starts out. And that kind of paves the way for Valjean's life in the future. So the rest of the book, after he gets his candlesticks, he does basically become a pillar of the community. But there's this officer who's following him this whole time, who has never gotten past the fact that Valjean had once committed a crime. And this officer, Javert, who's following Valjean, he's never able to reconcile what he thinks, that he thinks like Valjean is permanently a criminal, permanently awful. So when Valjean saves Javert's life, Javert is not able to deal with that and actually kills himself because he's just not able to deal with the idea of mercy. So I think this has a lot to say about peacemaking, right? Because you have this justice system in 19th century France that is very bad, that's locking people up out of crimes that they do out of desperation. And you have on one hand the bishop who's able to see that and is able to have mercy and give Valjean the means that he needs to be able to kind of turn around his life. And then you have Javert, who is not able to internalize that, and who, when an act of mercy happens to him from this person, he's just said, oh, this is a bad person, this person is irredeemable. He is unable to deal with that to the extent that he actually kills himself.
There's something that happens for Jean Valjean, I think, in that story where, at the beginning, he is a criminal, or at least like he is seen as a criminal by his society. And in the end, he's not. Like, he becomes this kind of important figure in his community. And so there's some sort of like reformation that happens there. And, he goes to jail, he steals again, he has the priest forgive him, he has like, these other things that go on in his life. And I'm wondering, what do you think was necessary for Jean Valjean's like reformation in that sense? Like, what aspects of his experience do you think led him to becoming like, to make peace kind of with society?
Yeah, so I think the best way I can answer this, and I'm not like a expert on 19th century France or literature, is that the way that he's treated by society really changes, right? So at the beginning, he steals out of a place of desperation for himself and his family. The way society treats that says you have to go to jail for 5 years because you stole a loaf of bread. The second time he steals, when he gets out of prison, the way that society or the bishop treats him is very different. So the bishop says, I give you these things, and I give you these things to start a new life with. And so what's interesting is Jean Valjean himself maybe is not changing that much over the course of that time, like in his internal like moral state, because he's doing something for the benefit of his family at the beginning. He's doing something for the benefit of society afterwards. But the way that society treats him really changes the way that he acts. We're labeling him as a criminal versus, saying that you just don't have the resources that you need to become your best self, I guess, become this person who's really contributing to society.
Given that we just heard that Jean-Val maybe didn't totally change, maybe didn't change a lot, but the way that society responded to him did change, I'm wondering how you see Javert's position in that. Like, did he change? Could he have changed? Could society have done something that would have helped him change? And ultimately, why is it that he couldn't reconcile this change for Jean-Val?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's like if Javert himself had encountered the bishop, for example, and the bishop showed him mercy as well, like maybe that would have set him on a different path. I think maybe possibly that's the case. There are some people also who think that Javert is like a representation of the law, and therefore, like, as this immutable like idea, he couldn't have actually changed. I don't know. I prefer to see him as a character, and so I think maybe there would have been a chance for reformation if he had met the bishop first and maybe have been introduced to this idea of mercy in a way that was maybe less jarring to him, right? Which is like this guy that he has been chasing after for years, saving his life was just like too much for him to handle. Obviously very dramatic for a literary sense. But if these were real people, then I think that might have been possible. But yeah, I think the issue with Javert in the book, right, is that he cannot even begin to comprehend mercy. Is that once someone has done something bad to him, they're just always a criminal, and there's just like this disconnect between them ever doing anything good.
Yeah. I find that super interesting because there's like this implication that, Javert didn't necessarily come into contact with mercy at the beginning, and so wasn't set on a track to change or to comprehend what mercy could do, which is super interesting considering him as a person in power or a representation of the law, that, he also would have needed to come into contact with the merciful bishop, with the mercy, in order to reconcile something even outside of himself as he's watching it.
Yeah, I find that like really interesting from the perspective too of like, this is a story of peacemaking, and it's like, I struggled at first to kind of figure out who is making peace with who. And I think that, you know, everybody is like in a kind of conversation of peacemaking with each other. But what's interesting is the one that fails is the one between Javert and Jean Valjean. And that's the only one that fails in this story of peacemaking. Like, everybody else reconciles. And what's interesting to me about that is that, like, Javert is the reason it fails, but Javert never did anything wrong in the sense that he never, like, committed a crime. And yet it is Javert's inability to, like, change that is what prevents peace from being made, even though, like you would think it's Jean Valjean's responsibility to change.
So I guess the second part of my story comes from when I was living in Zambia for about a year and a half after I graduated college. And Zambia is in Southern Africa. It's a very poor country. And I was working in like agriculture and sanitation, economic development projects. So I went to church once in Zambia, and it was kind of like it's like a mixed church. Like there was a lot of foreigners, there was a lot of Zambians. It was just like I think like a Protestant church. And there was a guest preacher preaching who was actually a white British woman. And this is just like one of the sermons that I've heard that has stuck with me and will probably stick with me my entire life. So she was talking about how when she moved to Zambia, the first year that she moved there, she got her house broken into like 4 times, I think. And she was really upset about this, as one is when their house is broken into. And she started thinking about that, and she was like, well, I have so much. I am so rich, and these people are stealing from me because they need something. And basically my country has exploited this country for resources, has colonized this country over a course of years. And basically I am rich partially because of this. And so like thinking about this, I cannot be upset that my wealth is being taken from me, because basically my wealth is an accident of birth. And that was so powerful to me. I think I don't have time to get into like maybe colonialism here, but it is just a fact that your wealth and your status in life is largely determined by where you're born, right? So if you're born in the US, many of the members of these podcasts, right, you're born in the US, you're born into like an upper middle class family, that's just luck. Versus if you're born in Zambia, you are just much more likely to be born poor because of these historical factors, because of many factors. And that just determines the opportunities that you have in life. So I thought it was just really powerful that she brought in kind of these society-wide injustices and kind of was able to look at her own life through this lens. Then I think about a year after that, my own house actually got broken into. And I thought about that a lot, I think. This was like about a week before I was set to leave Zambia. Someone broke into my house and stole like basically all of our electronics, but nothing else. So I was interestingly like telling one of my friends from work this story of the pastor, right? And then he responded, well, like, that's great, but there also has to be rule of law. So I also thought that was really interesting, because I do think that's true, right? Like on a society-wide level, like there should be things to prevent stealing. But I also think on the individual level, right, kind of related to the bishop who has a lot, who like has these silver candlesticks, and Valjean who doesn't. I think on an individual level, I still strongly agree with the pastor that as rich people who are basically, you know, for the most part, born into wealth, we have a responsibility to have mercy and to forgive. And I think people ask me, they're like, well, isn't kind of the logical conclusion of that argument just give people things? And I think, yes, like that is what I tried to do. Like, I think there's one level, like, you know, don't be upset or too upset if people steal your stuff. But the second is, I think we do have like an active duty to other people who are born basically less lucky than us to, you know, kind of do things.
Yeah, I love that. I love both like that as like just a tension that like I think a lot of people feel a lot of the time with like, there's always the question of like homelessness. When you see people who are homeless on the streets, what is my responsibility to that person, being part of this kind of broader society that has failed that person? So I think that's interesting. I also really like the parallels between, you talked about the rule of law and like this idea that like, don't we need the rule of law? And then you earlier talked about how some people see Javert as the embodiment of the law, and how when we see Javert in that way, then we see him as inflexible. Like he can't bend to this kind of like idea of mercy because he is the law. And so I'm wondering like to what degree that's true. Like, is there a way that we can understand the law that allows it to bend to mercy? Like, are there more kind of expansive views of what justice, like a justice system can mean?
And can I just add real quick, are there also, if the law can't, whether it can or can't bend towards mercy, are there ways that we can bend toward mercy within, that justice system also?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would say from my perspective, like probably, putting someone in jail for 5 years for stealing a loaf of bread is like not a good thing. Putting someone in jail for 5 years for like smoking weed is also probably not a good thing in our modern context. I think from an economist's perspective, what I would like to see is just fewer people getting into these situations in the first place. Again, where you're doing something like stealing, for example, because you're in a difficult situation. I was actually just looking up kind of like statistics on this and like whether a better social safety net basically leads to less crime. And it is correlated with less crime. I think it's hard to figure out like exactly what the causality is. But I am hopeful that, if people have the essential things that they need to live, you're not going to be doing things, right, like stealing. And I think that this is something that if you are also wealthy, like many of the people on the podcast, listening to the podcast are, this is probably something you have to consider too, is if like someone, mugs you, for example, takes your wallet, is that something that you want to turn them into the authorities for, when they probably did it out of a place of desperation? I think this is obviously nonviolent crime. I think if someone commits like bodily harm against me, then that is another question. But for this, for example, I wouldn't want to like turn the people in who stole my laptop in Zambia.
Yeah, I mean, I think about that question all the time. Like, should we use an unfair punishment over using no punishment at all? So like if somebody steals from me, I do think they should be punished in some way, or I think that justice needs to happen. But do I think that they should go to jail for 5 years? Maybe not. And so does that mean I just don't turn them in at all? And like, if those are my two like options, then I think that sometimes the answer is just no, I don't turn them in, which I think, it's not the right answer, because the right answer is that like we need to bring resolution to this situation, because this person is probably, or is likely going to go and steal from somebody else. And that's not only a problem for the other person who's being stolen from, but it's also a problem for them because it means that they still haven't had their needs met. And so like it does nothing for me to not turn them in, but it also does harm for me to turn them in. And so yeah, I just have similar kind of like conflicting thoughts there.
Yeah, I really like the way that you frame that, I think, because it's like, yeah, I do believe that like rule of law is a good thing. I do believe like people should not be stealing from one another, but it's like, how do I act in this like bad system that we already have, which does cause this tension. Yeah, I love the way that you put that.
I would add to Abasi your point that, on the one hand, it's a bad thing that the person is going to go steal again because it means their needs haven't been met still, that, stealing once is not like a sustainable solution. It's also a bad thing because that person is probably going to steal from someone who hasn't thought about it as deeply as you have and is going to turn them in. Right. So, like when they're doing something that isn't okay, given the justice system that we have, like it's going to burn them even if, you're not the one who like chooses to cause them harm, which is why I always get stuck on like, no, I do not think this person should go to jail for 5 years, because what does that do for anyone? You know, in the psychology world, we try to have natural consequences, but consequences that move toward healing in some way. Like, you sit down with the person that you stole from and you talk about it and you come to a mutual understanding of what happened. Even if there's an apology and there's like someone who feels like they were wronged, it's just, there needs to be something rehabilitative to it. There's some, like, and maybe that's internal and external, of this person needs resources in order to not need to steal. And this person may also need to be connected to something that they're often not connected to, which is the consequences of violence. I mean, if we, not that stealing is necessarily violence, but it can be, because it's scary. And because you might actually lose something that maybe they needed the value of it more, but it might have also been, you know, really sentimental to you. And I think there is something dehumanizing about the way that the justice system disconnects you from the consequences of your actions, and so disconnects you from a capacity for empathy, which kind of feels like where Javert is to me.
Yeah, I think that like that idea of separating, you know, even the person who commits the crime from empathy, that like that's what the criminal justice system does is really interesting. And I also really like the idea that you talked about, how if it's not rehabilitative, if it's not going to help the person, then it doesn't prevent future violence or future harm, particularly in the case of theft, but also in like other cases, because the case of theft, like you mentioned, is, you know, it's directly this person identifies that they have a need and they take it from somebody. So as I understand it, the final act of your story talks specifically about that kind of almost rehabilitative aspect, or how justice can be seen differently.
Yeah, so I recently wrote a story for Vox about cash transfers for formerly incarcerated people, and I thought this was like a super cool story and tied into Les Mis and the idea of peacemaking quite well, because it's kind of doing what the bishop is doing, but on a society-wide level in this county in Florida. So basically, what is happening is this is a pilot program with 115 formerly incarcerated people in Florida, and it's giving them $7,500 in cash, kind of in monthly installments over the course of a year. And so it was actually designed and implemented by other people who had been in prison. And so they were trying to figure out, you know, what do people need? Like, people come out of prison, they're often experiencing homelessness. They often don't have money for basic needs like a home or car or food. Or, for example, if they're going back to live with their family, they don't have money to contribute to the family and to the community. And so what this is doing is this is trying to put this money for these basic needs and also giving back to the community into these people's hands, with the hope that will help them be like more productive members of society in the future. And there were some really good quotes by the people who are running this study that I would just like to cite in this podcast. So I think one of them is the manager of this program, who comes out of a community program that works with formerly incarcerated people and on many things. People face choices basically between, you know, buying food, paying probation fees, all of these different things that you face. And he said, the crime is in your bank account. You've been labeled that you're too poor to be free. And that, I think, you know, that is basically what happens to Jean Valjean at the beginning of Les Mis. It's still happening today. And that's just horrible. And so programs like this are trying to remedy that, to ensure that people are like not going back to prison just because they're, again, quote, like too poor to be free. I think the second quote that I really like, and how this relates to the criminal justice system and how this relates to people going back to prison, is from one of the researchers in the project, and who says, people ask, do people deserve this? You know, they were in prison. Do they deserve to get free money, quote unquote? So he says, I think the question instead should be, do we all deserve safer communities? The answer is yes, that means we want to do everything we can to help ensure people with felony records live crime-free lives and don't recidivate. If we can help folks leave our criminal justice system and get jobs, pay taxes, and become great tenants and homeowners and so on and so forth, this only contributes to our society rather than detracting from it. So this more mercy-based approach that, again, the bishop takes and that this program is taking is something that can benefit not only people, but also society as a whole. And I think this is like one really cool way forward. I think also, as we have been discussing, like wholesale reform of the criminal justice system is probably necessary, but given this context that we live in, I think something like cash transfers can be really awesome.
So given like all of this, I'm curious, Siobhan, if there is any one principle of peacemaking that you think we can take from this story.
Yeah, so I think there are maybe a couple, so maybe we can boil it down to one. I think the first one that comes to mind is mercy from the story of Les Mis. Both the bishop shows mercy and then Javert also does. But then I think there's the economic inequality and injustice piece. So the bishop's mercy and forgiveness as a person who's kind of in this position of more power includes also kind of this economic element, which I think is really interesting and maybe what makes this story a little bit different.
I really like that. It sounds to me like we're almost conceptualizing mercy as recognizing and addressing the need behind the conflict.
Yeah. And I think what's crucial here is that like we've been talking about this, like I think we've just kind of like been assuming this, but it's like a really fascinating thought is that like we're thinking about what does the person who instigated the conflict need. And I say instigated, but like of course the conflict was instigated from like by society treating Jean Valjean the way that society treated him, and like Javert and the bishop were part of this like overarching society that created the circumstances for the conflict. But instead of thinking like how do we make the bishop well or like fill the bishop's need because he was just stolen from, or whoever like lost the loaf of bread, what we're thinking about is the need of Jean Valjean because he is the one who we recognize as clearly at need here, but is not always recognized as at need. Like oftentimes we think that the person who does the harm can't possibly be the one that has a need that needs to be met.
Well, yeah, I guess thank you for having me on the podcast and allowing me to share these stories.
Tell me what's a life? I've been feeling starstruck, seeing human love thrive in this really long dusk. Guess it's really all love, 7 billion of us. Then I read the headlines. Tell me what's a life? It's potlucks of violence, corn shucked to conscience, hot sauce, blood diamonds. Everybody pitching in forks red with silence. We already ate up that cornbread of kindness. Or it's something in between. We got stories in our stories, knowing stories what it seems. As we stumble, as we fall, we watch each other and we scream. If our weakness is our glory, it's more glory to be seen.
This has been the Peacemakers podcast, produced and hosted by me, Obasi Shah, and my co-host, Michael O'Brien. The intro and outro song, What's a Life, is by me and produced by Eerie Skies. The interludes are produced by Gabe Gladstein of the pop duo Running On Everything. If you liked this episode and want to reflect more, come visit our website at principlesofpeacemaking.org, where you can find more of our content and information on how to support us. Our guest today was Siobhan McDonough. Thanks, Siobhan, and thank you for listening. Now go and make peace.